Hello, everybody, and welcome to Two Geeks and One Noob, where we gather friends of similar interests and maybe not so similar, and discuss, joke, learn more about, and generally have fun with geek culture. On today's episode, we're going one geek, two noobs, and are bringing back the Q&A format. And we're asking David about horror films.
More the genre, because, yeah.
Okay.
More just the genre.
Yeah, that's fine. Horror genre. It just doesn't sound right.
Yeah, you're right.
You may find all of the questions geared towards movies.
That's
so
fine.
Be ready.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Horror films, horror movies.
I'll be the literary person here then.
Oh, so you're like doing like books and stuff too, right?
I'm doing the genre.
The
Yes.
genre. Okay. Cool.
Yep. So, right off the bat, I do want to make a quick distinction.
Okay. Go for it.
Or a couple quick distinctions. Horror is not it's not terror. It is not thriller. If done well, it will more than likely encompass those or aspects of those. Horror overlaps with other genres very well, namely sci-fi, occasionally science fantasy. I imagine probably not going to go in the weeds on that. That's a different topic altogether.
Now, when you say sci-fi, sorry, would you say like that encompasses like the like fantasy style stuff too, like werewolves and vampires and such like that, or is it just?
I would say those are more tent poles of the horror genre.
Okay.
When I say science fantasy, I mean less on the technical side and more with just a technical setting.
Okay.
So just to get that one out of the way quick, no, I said I wasn't going to go on that one, but just to make that delineation.
Like
Star Trek and Dune are sci-fi. Star Wars is science fantasy.
Right.
Yeah.
So like in the horror genre of it, like what would be an example of that? Just so I have it in my head.
So War of the Worlds would be an example of horror and sci-fi.
Okay.
And actually that one's pretty even split between the two, where it could be classified as either, and there's plenty of debate about that actually.
Gotcha.
Though I do believe some have outright said, well, Orson Welles sold it as sci-fi, therefore it's sci-fi. The end of story. Fine, whatever. It still has horror elements.
Right. Yeah.
Gothica, Event Horizon, those are more. They're a specific subgenre of horror, but they are in a science fiction setting.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So continue on your what you were saying.
So suspense, thriller, horror, slasher. These are all things that get lumped up together.
Mm-hmm.
Suspense is more of the very keep you guessing, edge of your seat style. Arguably, I would put something like the Jason Bourne movies, where it's kind of a spy thriller. Where it's less geared towards the action and more geared towards the political or just the intrigue aspect.
Right. More of a psychological kind of thing. Got it.
That would be thriller. Again, it can have horror elements. A lot of the M. Night Shyamalan movies are billed as horror. They're probably more accurate to call them thrillers or suspense with horror. Because the crux of the storyline does not pivot around the horror aspect, but more around the suspense of, wait, am I putting these thoughts together in the right order? That sort of thing.
Gotcha.
Now, for thriller or terror and horror, the differentiation I make is, put simply, terror or thriller is more the expectation of pessimism, whereas horror is more the experience of pessimism. Or pessimism being overwhelmed met and overwhelmed.
Right.
So kind of my very tongue-in-cheek answer to example of this is, terror is smelling something rotting in your house. Horror is realizing it's coming from the chimney. And to a child, additional horror is realizing it's December 25th. So
yeah.
Does that help clear that up a little bit?
I think so, yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. There are a lot of things that make horror, but when horror is at its best is usually whenever they're taking a philosophical concept, taking it to a logical extreme, and trying to be respectful to it, but viewing that logical extreme from a pessimistic view. So, for example, the the George Romero movies, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead.
Okay.
Not Shaun of the Dead. Still good, but no.
The comedy version of horror. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah. Those movies were trying to take a very valid concern by a lot of people and a lot of philosophers at the time on how commercialism, how consumerism as a whole would affect us. So it depends on who's telling the story. If they're going to address those actual concerns and the positives as well. But by and large, the crux of the story is going to be around the negatives of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think it was the second one, and I always get the order confused. I want to say it's Dawn of the Dead. Where the majority of the film takes place in a shopping mall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this is probably the statement that really clarified a lot of it for me, of the genre. There's a particular scene where the parents, right towards the beginning of the outbreak, are clearly concerned, trying to call to their kids who are too distracted in one of the stores. The kids get turned and immediately start going after the parents.
Oof. Yeah.
It's a very rough scene. It's a very visceral scene.
Mm-hmm.
But it was Romero's point of saying, are we going to show this to our kids and they'll be so consumed with stuff that they completely forget the giver? And I'm probably horribly misquoting his intent on that one, probably horribly misquoting how he would have stated that.
Right.
But the intent was more of, are we really sure we want to go down this road?
Yeah.
And just another expectation setting statement. I'm not saying this to get y'all to watch horror, because people have varying reasons for why they like it, why they don't like it. So I'm not trying to sell y'all on liking it.
Mm-hmm.
Potentially, maybe finding something that you would think is, yeah, okay, maybe that's palpable.
Yeah.
But it's not at all to try to convince someone to change their opinions. It's more of just, okay, please at least understand the craft of why.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like this particular episode is, there are people who very much enjoy horror films and the horror genre. And a lot of what we do on this show is to try to get people to give something a chance.
Right.
And like you said, it's not necessarily trying to get someone to like horror or to even give it a chance. It's more, if something piques your interest, great. If not, it's totally up to you.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I have a lot of family who they have very strong personal convictions that, no, I'm not going near that. I'm not allowing it in my home even.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to set the expectation now. This is not to tell you you need to change your views, but more of the sense of, okay, but please try to understand why other people like it.
Yeah. And respect the writing and the
exactly the craft of it when done well.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. Caleb, did you want to start off the Q&A part of this?
Sure. Let me pull up my notes because I'm a dummy and didn't have it ready.
Okay, so break here.
So, doing it live. Let me look dumb.
Resisting urge to quote that.
So, my first question for you is, what about horror movies interest you personally?
All right. So, I typically viewed horror as kind of okay, it's the excuse for blood, guts, and flesh. All right, not my thing. It wasn't really until I had heard that analogy of George Romero and why he was pushing the certain visual motifs, very graphic visual motifs, in his original series, that it really kind of clicked for me of, no, this is a really good medium for telling very hard concerns. And it can be used well, it can be used very poorly. There are examples of both, and then there are others who can play at it. So as much as I enjoy the genre, I am probably most picky about media in that genre or in this genre than most others, in part because it is so often, in my opinion, misused.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely makes
That
sense.
actually kind of ties into another question I have was, what is your take on horror versus slasher? Because like you said, there's definitely movies where they have that, like, they have the balance well, but then they just kind of go overboard and lean into the slasher, and it's like, this isn't really a horror, this is just a really gory movie for the sake of being gory. And so I was curious what your take on that is, which you kind of perfectly led right into that question.
And blindly, I might add.
Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of the slasher film, when I'm referring to those, I'm referring to stuff like somewhat more just the sequels of Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th. To its credit, Halloween is actually doing a pretty good job of staying in line with the horror genre. But yeah, piranhas, that sort of thing, where it's like this is an excuse to have middlingly attractive actors and actresses run around scantily clad and spraying them with fake blood. No,
I wasn't even sure if Piranha would be in that horror genre, because like,
yeah, I wouldn't put it so much in the horror.
It definitely went more like just that adult route and less horror, in my opinion. But you also know a lot more about this topic than I do. So,
well, I'm not gonna say I know all at all. I don't want that to be construed as the case. Period.
That again, on this show, we do not.
Out of the three of us, you definitely have the most experience with horror genre than the rest of us. I've seen a grand total of maybe 3 movies in that genre, and Dan, maybe 1 or 2?
I've seen a couple that I would consider on the horror side, but more so on the suspense side, because it's like, just for an example, like Final Destination. Like, it has more so the suspenseful side of things, or thriller, but there's some at least what I would think of as horror. But like I said, I don't have any clue. I just watched it.
So full confession, I have only seen one of those. It was not the first one. I remember that much. And that one leaned far closer to what I would consider slasher, but definitely had heavy suspense elements to it.
See, I wouldn't even consider it slasher, though, because it's, or at least the ones that I've seen. I think I saw 1, 2, and 3.
When we say slasher, we mean more and just the, like, blood and guts, and not so much like an actual monster running around with a machete.
Right.
And as much as we do just lots of gore and death and whatnot.
Yeah,
I guess that's kind of what the slasher genre technically covers.
Yeah. Which the first 3 of that set of movies was more so on the suspense side of things, where it's more, when are you gonna die, and how are you gonna die, not, oh, let's just do blood and guts.
It's not a matter of if you make it through. It's, we know what's going to happen. Just when is it going to happen?
Exactly. And that, that whistle track of, like, like literally just that throughout the entire movie of, like, oh, that's leading up to a kill. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Or not even a kill, just a death.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, yeah, the one I saw could have been just at the time I was in a weird mood, but that one came across as very clearly suspense, but definitely had elements that could have pushed it a little bit more towards slasher.
Mm-hmm.
But typically with horror, they're trying to make a point.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, what was the original question?
Oh, it was your take on horror versus slasher.
Okay. Yeah. So, the slasher is one of those genres that I don't fully get the appeal of, and I was kind of alluding to this earlier with Dan. There are some subgenres that are legitimately horror, but at least in my opinion, they lean more towards slasher than anything else, particularly body horror.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, most body horror movies are going to end up in meme culture as, oh my gosh, someone thought that was a good idea. Really?
Right.
Yeah.
There's one in particular. I'll just say it's you can probably find it in the 99-cent section. But it's a very human tale. Yeah. That would be body horror, and it's like no, sorry. The whole
I do not larva that one
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah,
I agree 100%. Like that one just never appealed to me. I guess it's just kind of like that comparison to people going and watching fights in the Coliseum. It's just like there's some people that just have this internal draw to where they want to see what's going to happen with that, and not necessarily that it interests them per se. It's just for whatever reason that catches their eye, and that like the curiosity gets the better of them. Like, oh, I'm kind of curious what happens there.
Yeah, it's like watching a train wreck. You can't turn your head away, but you really don't want to see it.
Kind of, yeah. But yeah, Caleb, I think that's probably a very, very healthy outlook. And if you like those movies, please understand, we're not insulting you.
No, not at all.
We just don't.
We just don't.
We ourselves are trying to understand the appeal.
Yeah. That genre doesn't mesh with us. It just like what David said at the start, was just like, we're not going to sit here and bash horror movies or bash thrillers or any of that, or the slashes or any of that. We have that appreciation for it because we know that there is that appeal for it. We know that storytelling or that art style appeals to people. We're just saying that that's not something that we personally mesh with.
Right. Yeah. So I think that probably gave a very clear expectation setting. So I think we're probably good on that front now. Yeah. So did that answer your question on the delineation?
Yes.
Okay.
I think Dan had a couple questions as well. So since we already covered two of mine, I'll leave it up to Dan for the next two.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess one of the questions I have, and you kind of covered it a little bit, what aspects of a movie or book or whatever media you use do you qualify as true horror?
So again, going on the definition that horror is pushing a point and having the consumer kind of think deeper as a warning about a topic.
Can you give like a couple of examples? Like I know you kind of gave World War Z as like the sci-fi version, but like a couple of different ones that you would look to and go, okay, this is coming across as this point, and this is how they're doing it.
Right. So typically, if it has a running motif, so somewhat derisive, but again, the movie's been out for almost 20 years. Oh, we're old. But I would even argue that Sixth Sense is a horror movie.
Okay. Yeah.
It is pushing that motif of, if you were dead, would you know it? Is there an afterlife? It's asking these questions just by visual input, mostly in that case. Other film media, and one of my personal favorite subgenres of horror is cosmic horror. So something like Event Horizon. Mentioned it earlier, but Event Horizon, through context and through the exploration of the entire meaning why that crew is out there, They were there partly for mining, but also just pushing boundaries. And one of the other crew members poignantly stating, "No, we're here to further science because nothing else matters." Cosmic horror in that case, or in the case of this film, is asking that question of, are we sure we're alone? Are we sure that there's nothing else? And the flip side of cosmic horror is usually the realization of, no, you ain't. And if you want another specific example of that, anything by H.P. Lovecraft, just about. There are a handful of his short stories that aren't, but the vast majority of them are very much cosmic horror.
Okay.
Now, in his case, they're very warped perspectives, but that's kind of his point.
Yeah. So, would there be a difference between cosmic and just straight up demonic? Or because I've always heard of like his stuff is more being demonic, like Cthulhu and such like that, where it's like, go ahead and jump in whenever.
No, you're good. You're good. So that is a debate I've heard. I have not really gotten into much.
Because when I think cosmic, I think like outer
space,
yeah. Like because as far as I knew, Cthulhu and such were not spatial.
So that's part of the debate, and to me, it's settled because in the books it is referenced that all of the Eldritch beings are spacefaring.
Huh.
Right.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So in that case, they're Eldritch. Now, here's where the confusion lies and where I've seen the debates key off. There's always cultists who worship the Eldritch. Now, in that regard, yeah, I could see demonic horror. There are other cases where it's very clear cut. Very clear cut. There is no room for argumentation. Paranormal Activity, The Rite, Exorcist. These are very clearly demonic horror. And those are some that those are hit or miss for me, personally. And again, this gets into that personal conviction area.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, you know what? Yeah, no.
Because it gets a little too on the real side for our beliefs.
Yeah. Yeah. For my beliefs, it's like, oh, no, that's too far.
Yeah.
And sometimes it just depends on the installment. Because I know I want to say it's the second Paranormal Activity I have a very hard time watching. But the rest of them, it's like, okay, yeah, this is fine.
Yeah.
And it's all the same subject matter. It's just the presentation of.
Yeah.
Some of Sam Raimi's work. Some of it is very much like, oh, this is fun. And actually, probably his most famous horror work is one of those that borders the line between horror and slasher. And that's Evil Dead. The original Evil Dead.
Okay.
And then pretty much everything after that just realized like, no, this is too corny to be horror anymore. So we're just going to make it a comedy. And that's great comedy. Very dark comedy, but great comedy. Anyway. So yeah, there's when you get into subgenres, you see it in music, you see it in obviously horror. In my opinion, anytime you get to the point of subgenre, there's always going to be debate.
Yeah, because everybody's going to have their own interpretation of those things. So yeah,
right. And part of that is going to be reflected by, or it's going to be a reflection of the individual's worldview. So as you already stated, and I affirmed, with our worldview, yeah, demonic horror is going to be very hit or miss.
Yeah,
if hit at all.
Yeah, because I mean, it's one thing if you're thinking of it as like, and again, it's kind of the difference between the demonic and cosmic thing is like, it's. I always thought of like the Cthulhu stuff as it was more extra dimensional.
It is.
Right. So, well, that's the thing is like, if they're spacefaring, like it might be spacefaring in a different dimension, but like, you know, for us, they're just coming up through a different dimension.
Yeah.
So at least that's the way I think of it. I don't know.
Okay.
I could be wrong, but
I mean, they are like to lore, and we'll probably get plenty of people listening like, that's not it, you misread it.
But again,
To
it's our
lore.
own worldview and our own perspective on things. So
Yeah, to lore in the H.P. Lovecraft universe, the Eldritch beings are spacefaring, and they are technically extra dimensional. But they created the Earth. They're old Eldritch. So the Earth is theirs by right.
right.
But point being, they're spacefaring and they are extra dimensional. Both. Anyway.
Very interesting. Okay. So I guess you also kind of covered a little bit of this as well, but my next question was like what aspects of horror actually detracts you from, because like you've said, like if it's on a realistic side of things, or like it gets too real, like you said, that kind of detracts you from it. But is there anything else that kind of like, yeah, no, I'm gonna stay away from that?
Yeah. So yeah, as again, just to reiterate, if it gets too real by my standard of it, from either things I've seen, things I've read up on, it's like, yeah, no. And sadly, y'all have actually come across that one.
Yep.
With me, and I think that threw both of y'all for a loop too.
Just a tad. Yeah.
But one of the things that gets me, I can appreciate it still, but it's more like a once and done type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's typically if it's very clear that the premise comes from a skewed worldview. So there are some points that people are trying to make in horror where it's like, but that's not how the world works. And I'm not going to name names on that one. Because, I mean, the point of horror, in my mind, is to get the audience thinking.
Yeah.
Is it to scare them? Yes. Scare them to think. Think through the issue being presented. So if there are common motifs, so back to the George Romero example, it takes place in a mall.
Right.
Everyone's talking about which stores are actually useful. Yeah, pretty heavy emphasis on useful consumerism.
Yeah.
And the third one, pretty heavy emphasis on like McCarthy era Red Scare type stuffs. Okay, we know what the motif is. War of the Worlds. Is space exploration something we're meant for?
Yeah.
Pretty heavy motif there. Were we right to send out the probes to see if there's other life? Again, pretty heavy motif there. The constant visage of red and questioning, hang on, why are so many people ignoring me? Pretty heavy motif in Sixth Sense. So by and large, you have to be paying very close attention in horror to get the motif they're pushing or get the questions they're asking.
Yeah.
And then there's pulp horror, like that kind of borders that boundary between slasher and horror pretty decently without being gratuitous one way or the other. A lot of Ridley Scott stuffs. Don't get me wrong, he's done some outright horror. But Red Eye, for example, fun movie, real fun movie.
I'm trying to think if I know which one that is.
Nathan Cillian Murphy. Sorry, yeah, Cillian Murphy. Is a terrorist on a domestic flight.
Okay.
A Red Eye domestic flight.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But it's a fun movie. I don't know, that kind of bends genres a little too much to be talking about here.
Yeah.
But
all right.
Yeah.
So
typically, if it gets too real, or to directly answer your question, if it gets too real from what I've researched or what I've read, because I get very bored and research easily, or stuff that I've actually experienced, it's mostly the former. Because again, I get very bored and research easily. But also, if it comes from a bad worldview,
yeah,
or a worldview that is pretty clearly not accurate or not encompassing most aspects, that's going to be a little hard to take.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can see horror in just scenes, not entire stories.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, couple of movies that come to mind when we're talking about this, and I'm curious if these would be considered on the horror side, because as far as I see them as horror, but like A Quiet Place,
Horror.
or
Sci-fi horror, but horror.
right. Or Bird Box, I think it's called.
Yep.
With Sandra
Horror.
Bullock. Okay. So those would be considered horror because like my impression of that one of A Quiet Place is it's more of the motif that you're talking about would be more so you need family.
Yep.
And if something takes that away,
What are you left with?
yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. So,
Yeah.
and then Bird Box is almost the same.
Very similar,
And-
but also asks the question of what defines family.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And A Quiet Place 2 kind of does that side of things as well, because
I actually have not seen this part 2.
it's not bad. It's not bad. I like it.
This coming from you who does not like horror, I take that as a huge accolade.
Yeah. That's kind of why I was bringing it up, because there are certain types of horror movies that I will actually watch.
Yeah.
Because either they have actors that I really like, or it actually is an intriguing story.
Yeah.
Because A Quiet Place is a really, really good story. I love
yeah.
the story.
Great story.
And then John Krasinski, like one of my favorite actors.
Yep.
So like, and that's kind of what bugs me about A Quiet Place too, is that it didn't have him in it, other than very small flashbacks. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But but yeah, like that brings a point of like, yes, there are certain types of movies that I will watch, and I'm trying to think of other ones. Like I've actually seen, World War Z, at least the updated version of it. I never saw the
World War Z, World of the
Or-
Worlds.
sorry, War of the Worlds. War of the Worlds.
As far as I know, there's only one World War Z movie.
Yeah, but that's actually another one that I think I've seen, and that would be considered on that side of things too. Somewhat, it's zombie movie. So
Yeah.
The
you
zombie
that one.
movies, I think, are supposed to be horror and never really are horror.
yeah,
That's more my take on it, and I think it's just because it's so saturated the market.
yeah,
Yeah,
But-
and
yeah.
Zombieland kind of took some of that horror element away from zombie.
Yeah. Like as soon as you start introducing more lighthearted fare into the same topic that is used as a trope for horror, that style of horror starts to diminish.
Mm.
Um,
See, I would
I guess that would
disagree.
be Shaun of the Dead as well. Did that?
yep.
Yeah, I would disagree just to an extent. I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, like it makes it palatable for people who don't like horror.
Yes, it makes the topic palatable for like as you said, exactly. So, for example, the initial, the original, what was it? American Werewolf in Paris
Mhm.
was horror. American Werewolf in London, or did I get those backwards? Can't remember the order. The first of the series was horror. The next one was kind of a and he traveled, have fun. And you'll notice in that though, they have to up the ante.
Right.
They have to introduce more viscera to it
Mm-hmm.
to kind of give that same shock value. So we see that throughout horror movies. We see that throughout horror games.
Mm. I have to say that's one thing I probably will never get into is the gaming side of it, because of I am not good with jump scares. So
Well,
yeah. Anyway,
that kind of gets to another point though. Horror, when done well, doesn't require jump scares
right.
at all.
Yeah.
Because they've set the expectation with this terror. And then whenever you see it finally, or you get a better sense of it, you realize it is so much worse than the terror aspect, the terror buildup actually could have been.
Right.
So one thing they're noticing in horror games, and why so many horror games lately, or modern horror games, kind of go to the wayside and aren't well viewed, typically it's because an exec says, "Hey, we need to make this more palatable for more people," and so they lose those aspects that make it horror.
Right.
Oh, co-op's really big. Well, what's inherent with co-op? You're not alone anymore.
Right. Yeah.
There's someone else with you on your side. Okay, well that takes out a big element of what makes horror games.
Yeah,
But
I could see that.
the typical trend is it leans closer to action. And there's one horror series that did a really good job of maintaining the horror aspect throughout its run, and that's the Fatal Frame series.
Okay.
Awesome psychological thriller, awesome horror. And Silent Hills did a decent job trying to keep it. And if you all recall the whole PT craze a couple years ago, there was a demo on the PlayStation Store called PT. You play through it and you realize it's playable trailer. That's what PT stands for.
Gotcha. Okay.
Sadly, you can't find this anymore. Petition Sony. And I say that just because my hard drive died. And I can't get it back. That did an excellent job of revitalizing the series. It was a trailer for Silent Hill. And with the name it was teasing at the end, kind of buried the lead on that one, Silent Hills, it implied that it's leaning into one particular side of the background lore for the series and pushing it further in that direction, which typically garnered more of the horror aspect. So while Silent Hill doesn't have any one point it's trying to push, the first 3 games in particular had elements that were very heavily based in just human psychology.
Yeah.
Now, granted, they were taking a very Jungian perspective, and that played into the storyline very well. But it was pushing it to a degree where you could very clearly tell they're trying to get you to think and not just about what your next move is.
Yeah.
But other horror games, Fear is a good example. Resident Evil. Yep, Resident Evil, where the first 2 were awesome. And then after that, it just became more of the same, a bit more in your face and more actiony. And it just didn't have that moment of, oh crap. One more modern example, where they actually said, you know what, make it as detailed as possible from the get-go. Make it as detailed as possible. Was Dead Space. Dead Space 1 starts off, sets the slow build motif, or the slow build storyline very quickly of, okay, yeah, you're going to be exploring, you're going to be kind of putting pieces together, but you're here mostly on a recon job, figure out what the heck's going on.
Well, you're supposed to be going there to do repairs.
Right.
Like the main character is actually just like an engineer going in to repair parts of the ship that got damaged, and so they don't even really know what's going on. They just get there thinking this is a simple repair, in and out, will be done. Surprise!
Yeah, but notice that the first large introduction to the game, you're not alone. You've got your entire crew with you, and it doesn't matter that you are just an engineer because you've got everyone else. And then very quickly, around the time that the player actually takes control of the character, you lose everyone. You lose everyone, and you're thrust into unknown.
Wow.
And the second one actually does a pretty good job of upping the ante in a, I hesitate to say respectful way in this case, because the entire point is to kind of get your audience on edge and thinking. But the second one does a really good job of upping the ante just enough to keep it fresh and keep that tone. But the problem a lot of people are starting to realize with horror games in particular, and to a lesser degree movies and shows, is you can only up the ante so much before you start crossing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed.
Right. Yeah.
Or completely changing genre.
Yeah.
I think that was what we saw a little bit with like Dead Space 3. It started
That's exactly
to
what
like
happened.
it went a different direction, whereas like Dead Space 2 didn't have quite the same extent of that horror element to it, but it stayed a little bit more true.
Yeah. And same with Resident Evil, same with Fear, same with and going
Though
into other media, same with Walking Dead.
I would argue Resident Evil Village started taking a turn back in the right in that original direction.
It did. And it did so very well by pretty much reinventing the series as a whole.
Yeah.
And frankly, I don't think we would have had Resident Evil Village without PT.
Yeah,
and
I could see that.
That could be a hot take, but a lot of the changes they made to the typical gameplay for Silent Hill with PT, we saw reflected in Resident Evil Village.
Cool. Well, that's all the questions I have. I will actually throw out one special / movie / show, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
That's actually on Disney Plus. It's a Marvel one called Werewolf by Night. And it's actually, from what I can see, a pretty decent representation of horror.
Okay.
It's not like uber scary or anything like that, but it's like it has that old timey like horror film, black and white, like that kind of feel to it. That I actually really enjoyed. It had a couple of little moments at the end that brought it kind of back to that Marvel comedy kind of thing.
Yeah.
At the very end.
And that's actually one thing that's very common with quite a bit of horror, actually.
Oh, yeah?
Is they'll throw in that lighthearted note right on the end, and they'll do it either as giving you hope or making you laugh and relieve the tension that they've built up. And as an audience goer, or as a film goer, as an audience member, I actually find that to be fairly respectful on behalf of the film creators or the media creators in general.
Yeah.
Because it reminds the audience, like, hey, just in case you got really involved, you're good, you're fine.
Take a second and step back.
Take a second, take a breath. You're good. It was the characters, not you.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Is that like you may need a new pair of pants, but it's okay. It's over now.
Yeah. Or like the end of Get Out.
Okay.
Where his buddy picks him up and gives the most cornball line. But it gets the audience laughing. It gets the main character laughing. Like, okay, everything's fine now.
Yeah. Speaking of that, another movie I just thought of was Disturbia.
Yes.
That one is another one that I've seen, and I actually really loved that movie.
It has horror elements.
Yeah.
But I would not classify that as horror. I would put that more in the territory of suspense.
Yes and no, because I can see the motif in that one.
There is definitely a motif of do you know your neighbors?
Do you know your neighbors? But then also,
I think that was the catchphrase for the movie.
Yeah,
or the tagline.
Yeah, exactly. But on the same side of that, though, or on the other side of that, it has that slight comedy throughout it.
Yeah,
that I actually really like about it, because like the friend
blaring Celine Dion from the roof. Yeah.
Well, like it just adds that little bit of lightening the suspense a bit to make it palatable again.
Yeah.
But it's just like, okay, this is scary, but it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And okay, another way to emphasize that point. Before horror was its own genre, there were scenes of horror throughout literature, throughout storytelling beforehand.
Yeah.
So, you can point to I'm blanking on if this was the Odyssey or the Iliad, but the Siren's Call in I want to say that's the Odyssey. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the sirens call off the ship. That scene could be classified as horror. He's making a point. He's trying to get his audience to listen. Like, hang on, are you sure of what's drawing you? If it is it good for you?
Right. Yeah.
Another example from our perspective of things. In the book of Isaiah, there's this scene where Isaiah, in a vision, sees the throne room of God, and that realization I would say, that moment of realization could be classified as horror, because it's exceeded what he's already assumed, and he already knew there was a vast difference. But his response is, "Oh, this was so much bigger than I thought it was."
Yeah. And explain a little bit more about what he saw, because I think that'll add to that, because you were talking about this earlier, off microphone.
Right.
That he saw.
Right, because he's seeing God in all of his splendor, and he's seeing the angels around him and how even the angels revere him. And he's standing there in God's presence, which already, through Judaic tradition and Christian tradition, you're not supposed to see God.
Right. And also the cherubim and seraphim and all that.
And they're singing holy, holy, holy on repeat ad nauseum. Probably wrong use of that phrase, gives the wrong impression.
But already in those two things, like if you look at the descriptions in the Bible of
who the
what
angels
those
were,
looked like,
yeah, they're already horrifying.
Like,
there's a reason why they started everything off with "fear not." Like,
right, exactly,
yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, I would for those reasons and a handful of others, I would classify that scene as horror. It's Isaiah not only trying to faithfully recount this vision he had, as was his charge, but to also kind of draw that point of, are we sure we know God for who God is?
Yeah.
So even in sacred texts, you'll see examples of it. So I think it can be used very well for what is to some considered a net positive.
Getting across a point that is very hard to see and very hard to internalize.
It is a wonderful illustrative tool. I think it being turned into a genre of itself was probably a good thing. I think where it is now, we're probably not going to see much good horror for a long time. Because I think so many of us are so desensitized to what fear is. And if you look back at some of the well-known horror directors or writers, many, maybe most, would state, I didn't respect the genre. I didn't like it because I'm too easily scared.
Right, yeah.
But that's the kicker. They knew what fear was.
Yeah.
So after a while, I think it gets to a point where creators can't create horror anymore.
And
at
least true horror.
Yeah.
Horror.
Yeah. So I think it gets to that point where the creators can't make effective horror, but I think we also have to be very cautious of, is the audience going to see this as horror, or are they going to see it as action or suspense or just, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think to kind of summarize those points, horror is basically a playground for philosophy. It's taking these ideas, taking these concepts, pushing them further, and it can cross boundaries of specialty and subject, but it's all kind of rooted in that philosophy of, what if we respectfully take this to a logical extreme?
Yeah.
And what are the inherent dangers of that happening? Whether we let it run away or we deliberately push it.
Yeah. And it can definitely be a scary thing.
Yeah. Intentionally.
And sometimes it can just make you think.
Yeah. So, anyway. Yeah. That's my take on horror. So, take it or leave it. If you like it just because you like it being scared, that's cool.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, David, for enlightening us. Caleb had to step out So we will say goodbye for him. But I think that's going to wrap up this episode. And if you guys are enjoying this the show, please keep listening, share it with your friends, and stay safe out there, guys.
Yep. And just remember, it's the spoopy season.
Happy Halloween.